It was an early morning in a small airport, the kind that most travelers pass through without a second thought. The light of dawn gently bathed the terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floors. A cold breeze swept in through the automatic doors, but inside the terminal, everything was calm and quiet. Ibrahim Traore, the president of a small yet proud nation, Burkina Faso, stood alone near Gate 37, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, no flashy accessories to announce his presence. He was just another man, waiting for his flight. The soft hum of travelers, busy with their own thoughts, blended with the distant sounds of announcements. Most people did not recognize Ibrahim. To the casual observer, he looked like a regular African businessman, or perhaps a weary traveler returning home. He preferred it this way. No cameras, no questions, just peace. It had been a long trip. A diplomatic visit to Europe had taken him away from home for weeks. Important meetings had been held. Conversations about Africa's future had been discussed. Matters of trade, sovereignty, and natural resources. He had done what was necessary for his country, and now all he wanted was to return home to the people he served. Ibrahim wasn't one to crave the limelight. He didn't want people to treat him differently. In fact, he had always made it a point to blend in. When he walked through the airport, he wanted to be a man of the people, not someone to be feared or idolized. The air around him, thick with diplomacy and political tensions, was left behind as he prepared to board a regular commercial flight to Ouagadougou, the capital of his country. As he made his way to the Air France flight, he greeted one of the workers at the gate in French with a warm smile. "Bonjour, ça va?" he asked, his voice light, almost casual. The airport worker smiled back, unaware of the true identity of the man before her. Ibrahim smiled to himself, grateful for the normalcy. He boarded the plane quietly, nodding at the flight attendants, who greeted him in a routine manner. He settled into his seat in business class, row 2A, near the window. It was a seat just like any other, though Ibrahim's presence on the plane was anything but ordinary. He sat back, staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. The world outside passed by as the plane prepared for takeoff. Behind him, in a few rows back, things were beginning to stir. A senior French businessman, the CEO of a major energy corporation, was also on the flight. He, however, was used to a different world, one of VIP lounges, red carpets, and luxury. As he arrived at the gate, he was told that business class was full. His impatience began to show. He didn't take no for an answer. "I'm a strategic partner in many African projects," he said arrogantly to the airline staff, his voice dripping with entitlement. To the CEO, the rules did not apply. He wasn't accustomed to being told no, especially not by anyone he perceived as being beneath him. His demands grew louder, more insistent. He demanded to be upgraded to first class, despite the fact that there was no seat available. The staff tried to explain the situation, but it was clear that the CEO wasn't listening. Meanwhile, Ibrahim sat quietly in his seat, oblivious to the unfolding drama. He wasn't concerned with the back and forth between the CEO and the staff. His mind was on his country, the work he still had to do when he returned. But his peaceful journey was about to be interrupted. The flight attendant, Emily, was called to resolve the situation. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, but when her eyes met Ibrahim's seat, something strange happened. She paused. For a brief moment, there was confusion in her eyes, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. Ibrahim Traore, a dark-skinned man in a hoodie, sat calmly in seat 2A. She glanced at the boarding pass in her hand and then back at him. There was no flashy watch, no sign of authority, just a man sitting quietly, reading his phone. To Emily, he didn't look like someone who belonged in business class. She took a moment before walking over to him, her steps firm but unsure. "Excuse me, monsieur. May I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her voice polite but somewhat cold. Ibrahim looked up, his face still calm. He handed her the boarding pass without hesitation. Emily glanced at it, then back at him, her expression faltering slightly. Everything seemed in order. His seat was properly assigned, yet something inside her didn't feel right. "I'm sorry, monsieur, but we may need to move you to accommodate another passenger," she said, her tone now more insistent. Ibrahim raised an eyebrow, unruffled. "And why me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. Emily hesitated for a moment, her forced smile never fading. "No reason, sir," she replied quickly. "Just a small adjustment for our guest." Ibrahim's eyes flickered. "A guest more important than me?" he asked, his voice calm, but the question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she smiled again, her discomfort barely concealed. Ibrahim simply sat back, settling into his seat once again. A few passengers, noticing the exchange, began to glance over. The tension in the air was palpable, but Ibrahim remained composed. He knew that this situation, however small, would be just the beginning of something bigger. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the atmosphere inside the cabin began to shift. The soft hum of the engines filled the air, but the silence that had once been peaceful was now charged with an unspoken tension. Ibrahim Traore, still seated in row 2A, had returned to his book. He wasn't paying attention to the whispers beginning to spread behind him, nor was he aware of the growing irritation of the French CEO. But that didn't mean he was oblivious. Ibrahim's mind was always sharp, always calculating, even when his exterior was calm. Behind him, the CEO's irritation had reached new heights. He wasn't used to waiting for anything, let alone being told no by airline staff. The idea that business class was full was an affront to him. He had traveled the world, cutting deals and securing power, and he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. The CEO tapped his foot impatiently, demanding an upgrade, as if the very rules of aviation should bend for him. Emily, the flight attendant, had already approached Ibrahim once, but now she was once again near the front of the cabin, conferring with other flight staff. It wasn't long before she returned to the back of the plane. She was still looking for a solution, but she wasn't prepared for what happened next. The CEO had now been standing by the gate for several minutes, his impatience visible to all. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a shine, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He wasn't used to being ignored. As he glanced down the cabin, his eyes landed on Ibrahim Traore. Something about the man in row 2A caught his attention. Maybe it was his unassuming appearance, or maybe it was the sense of quiet authority that seemed to emanate from him even in the simplicity of his attire. At first, the CEO shrugged it off, assuming the man wasn't important. But then he saw the staff giving Ibrahim more attention. There was something about this quiet, calm figure that made the CEO uneasy. In his mind, people like this didn't belong in business class. People who were humble, who didn't demand attention. People like that were meant to sit in economy. Emily, who had returned from consulting with her supervisors, was now walking down the aisle, her face tight with stress. The decision had been made. The CEO would be seated in business class, and someone else would have to move. There wasn't a choice. With a stiff expression, Emily approached Ibrahim's row. She didn't make eye contact immediately, as though unsure of how to continue. Ibrahim noticed the tension in her step, and he knew something wasn't right. When she finally looked at him, her forced smile was less than convincing. "Excuse me, monsieur," she began, her tone still polite but now tinged with an edge of impatience. "I'm afraid we need to make some adjustments. We have a very important passenger arriving, and we need you to move to economy." Ibrahim looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no flash of irritation. He was calm, too calm, almost like he had anticipated this moment. "And why me?" he asked, his voice still steady, but now with an air of quiet authority that made Emily pause. She hesitated, but then her professional training kicked in. "No reason, sir. It's just for operational reasons, to accommodate our guest." Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, his hands resting calmly in his lap. "A guest more important than me?" he asked, his voice still soft but the words clear. Emily faltered, unable to respond to the question directly. She hadn't expected such calm resistance. People usually complied, especially when faced with someone in a position of power like her. But Ibrahim wasn't just anyone, and he wasn't playing by her rules. She could feel her pride starting to sting, but she forced herself to smile again, trying to maintain control. "Sir," she said with a hint of coldness, "this is for operational reasons. We really need to make this adjustment. Please follow me." But Ibrahim wasn't moving. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He simply sat back in his seat and calmly looked out of the window. The people around him were starting to notice. The business class passengers, once absorbed in their own private worlds, began to glance over. The exchange between Ibrahim and Emily was drawing attention, but no one spoke. No one dared. Emily, frustrated by the resistance she faced, turned away and began to scan the other business class passengers. She was now on a mission to find someone, anyone, who could be moved. As her eyes scanned the cabin, she singled out another black man seated near the back of business class. His eyes widened in confusion as Emily approached him. "You, sir," she said, pointing at him. "We need you to move to economy." The man, clearly taken aback, asked, "Why me?" But Emily, already irritated, said nothing and snatched his boarding pass away. Ibrahim, still watching from his seat, knew what was happening. He could sense the discrimination in the air, the subtle, uncomfortable difference between the way people like him were treated and the way others were respected. And it wasn't just that. It was the way Emily, in her attempt to resolve the problem, was making decisions based on skin color, not ticketed seats. "Enough," Ibrahim said, standing up slowly. His voice was calm but filled with a quiet intensity. The passengers around him tensed, sensing that something was about to change. "I am not moving," Ibrahim said firmly. "You are making decisions based on skin, not on tickets. That's called discrimination." Emily was momentarily stunned. Her eyes widened as she looked at Ibrahim, realizing that he wasn't going to back down. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded stiffly and turned to walk away. Ibrahim sat back down, his posture straight, but his mind was racing. The storm had begun, but it wasn't over yet. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with a quiet tension that seemed to fill every corner. Emily, the flight attendant, had walked away, her movements stiff with frustration. She hadn't expected her authority to be questioned, especially not by someone who appeared to be just another ordinary passenger. Her mind raced, but there was no time for second-guessing. She had a job to do, and her priority was to ensure the CEO was seated properly. Ibrahim, on the other hand, sat still, his face calm as ever. He had made his point, and now he would wait. There was no need to escalate things further. His patience, like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface, was his greatest strength. He knew that the moment would come when the truth would be undeniable. Meanwhile, the CEO, still unaware of the significance of the man in row 2A, was growing more restless. He had been escorted to his seat in business class, still complaining about the inconvenience, still assuming that the situation was somehow beneath him. The flight attendants, eager to please him after his outburst, showered him with attention. Champagne was offered, a warm towel presented, and everything was done to make him feel like royalty. But as the plane soared higher into the sky, something began to shift. Ibrahim's presence was like a quiet shadow in the cabin, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the arrogance of the CEO. Every so often, the CEO would glance toward Ibrahim, but he quickly dismissed the thought, who could that man possibly be? As the flight carried on, Ibrahim remained silent. He didn't need to explain himself. He had no intention of asserting his power in a way that would draw attention. But his patience wasn't just a passive trait, it was a statement. The storm was still gathering, but when it came, it would be swift and unyielding. Then as the plane began its descent into Ouagadougou, the moment arrived. The first signs of change were subtle. The lights in the cabin flickered back on as the aircraft began its descent. Passengers fastened their seatbelts, preparing for landing. But outside the window, a different scene was unfolding. As the plane approached the airport, a convoy of black SUVs and military vehicles began to line up on the tarmac. The sheer scale of the security detail was impossible to ignore. There were dozens of vehicles, all positioned in a perfect line, ready for something important. The passengers, especially the CEO, began to whisper, "Who's arriving? Is there some kind of VIP?" One of the foreign passengers asked, their voice nervous. Another passenger replied, "I think this must be for someone very important." The CEO smirked, his chest puffing out in pride. "It's for me," he said, as if the entire world should be aware of his importance. He stood up and smoothed his suit, confident that the military honor guards had been called for his arrival. "I told you I'm involved in some of the biggest projects here in Africa," he boasted to the flight attendants. Emily, too, was certain that the security was for the CEO. She nodded in agreement, barely hiding her own sense of pride in the situation. The plane was now on the final approach, and she was already preparing to escort the CEO personally, as if he were the only passenger who mattered. She didn't give Ibrahim another glance, but as the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, everything changed. The passengers looked out the windows trying to make sense of the display of military strength. Their questions remained unanswered. Then as the plane came to a stop, the real story unfolded. The first to board the aircraft was a tall officer in a black beret. His boots echoed on the metal floor as he walked slowly down the aisle, his uniform sharp, his expression unreadable. He stopped at seat 2A, where Ibrahim sat quietly. His eyes met Ibrahim's, and with a respectful gesture, the officer raised his hand in a perfect military salute. "Mr. President, welcome home," the officer said, his voice clear and formal. A profound silence swept across the cabin. Emily's face turned pale, her eyes darting between the officer and Ibrahim, who stood slowly. Ibrahim's calm, dignified presence filled the space like a quiet storm, and at that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The CEO's smug expression faltered. He took a step back, his mouth opening in shock. "President?" he stammered, unable to comprehend the situation. He's the president?" Ibrahim simply nodded, his expression unchanged. He wasn't angry, nor was he proud. He was a man who knew his worth, who had earned his position not through arrogance, but through resilience and a quiet commitment to his people. Emily's hands began to tremble as the officer stepped aside, allowing Ibrahim to move toward the exit. She had been wrong. In that moment, all the assumptions she had made about the man she had tried to humiliate crumbled. The CEO, realizing his mistake, tried to salvage the situation, but there was no escaping the truth now. Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso, had walked among them as an ordinary man, humbly, quietly, without fanfare. And in doing so, he had exposed the arrogance and prejudice that ran beneath the surface of the people who thought themselves above others. As Ibrahim stepped off the plane, the full weight of the moment became clear. The military personnel, the ministers, and the waiting crowd beyond the airport fence all stood in attention as the nation's leader made his way to the tarmac. The crowd cheered, their applause echoing through the air as Ibrahim greeted them with a quiet dignity. Back on the plane, Emily and the CEO were not so fortunate. They were led off the aircraft by two officers, their hands cuffed tightly. Passengers watched in stunned silence as the two were escorted down the steps. There was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. The CEO, once so powerful, now looked like a child caught in a lie. Emily, too, was shaken, her earlier arrogance replaced by a deep, humbling fear. The moment had come to an end, but the ripple effects would last far longer. Ibrahim Traore had shown not only his strength and patience, but also the power of humility and respect. The storm that had been brewing, quiet and unnoticed, had now left its mark on everyone. Later, as the news spread across the world, the footage of the incident went viral. The message was clear. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up against injustice, no matter how subtle. Ibrahim's decision to walk among the people, to face his detractors with quiet strength, had forever changed the perception of true leadership. The story didn't just belong to one man anymore. It belonged to an entire continent, united in its strength and resilience, and it would be remembered as a moment that changed everything.